as today. They attempted to defy God. They were punished by the thing they feared most. Do you know the thing they feared most? Was being scattered. They didn't want to do that. And so they're being punished by that. They're going to be scattered. Before God dispersed the people, as he had a plan to scatter them, the people were to subdue the earth. At first thing he did was confuse what? What did he do the first to them? First thing, their language. Now, can you imagine trying to be something great on this earth, and you're going to build memorials and towers and all this thing, but no one could understand each other. Can you imagine what a fire drill that'd be? What a Chinese fire drill. No one understood each other. And so God did that first. They couldn't understand each other. In fact, that Babel means, you know what Babel means? Confusion. Yeah, we all know that. It means confusion. And they were confused, I'm telling you. And everything they did was to naught. It ended in nothing but chaos. In my mind, I see them, boy. They're trying to explain each other, and they just can't do it. They just can't communicate. And so they ignored God. They paid the price. It's interesting, and I'm pointing this out because I don't know how old this is. I'm fixing to read to you. But these archaeologists found this ancient tablet near that site where they think Babel was, the Tower of Babel. And it's pretty interesting, and you can take this with a grain of salt. They may have made it in 1932. I don't know, but here's what that clay tablet says that they found. The building of this illustrious tower offended the gods. In a night, they threw down what they had built and scattered them abroad, and made strange their speech. So that's exactly what happened. But, we don't know when that tablet was written. They did it long after the Tower of Babel. But it is interesting. Verse 9. Therefore its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole earth. And from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of the whole earth. To what we got today. Verses 10 through 26, you have the descendants of Shem. The descendants of Shem. Jesus Christ comes into the world through the descendants of Shem. From Seth to Abraham, and now the descendants of Shem is given because the descendants can be traced in verse 24 directly to Terah. And who was he? Abraham's father. Abraham's father, verse 24. Directly you're traced from Seth to Abraham, who Terah was Abraham's father. The first five names in this genealogy in verses 21 through 30 were given in the Table of Nations. They're included in chapter 11. And they're emphasizing the connection of all the descendants to this Eber. Verse 14. Terah is a direct descendant of Peleg, who descended from Eber, a Semitic people, that Jesus Christ is going to come. Have I confused you enough already? Are you with me? Kinda. You ought to have been me trying to prepare the class. It's interesting to me to see the length of life before the flood and the length of life after the flood. After the flood, the average lifespan was only half the number it was before the flood. Isn't that amazing? But there's something else too I want you to notice. The children were being conceived by younger parents after the flood. Before the flood, it was old parents, wasn't it? Every one of them old. but they had children. God blessed Abraham. But now you see this, it's different now. The children are being conceived by younger parents, like Shem was 100 when Apakashad was born. But Apakashad was 35 when his son was born, Shelah, 35. And that's in chapter 11, verses 10 through 12. Here's why I mentioned it. You know what happens when you have all these younger people having children instead of the old people having children? Do you know what the result is? Think about it. If you have all these young parents having children, it's going to cause something drastic on the earth. A population explosion. And that's what you got here. A population explosion. Now in verses 27 through 32, you have the history of Terah, Abraham's father. The three patriarchs are of interest here. Terah was the father of Abraham, who became the father of the chosen family. Nahor is the ancestor of Rebekah, and who will marry Isaac. Chapter 11, verse 29, chapter 22, verse 20 and 23. This is stuff like this is just amazing. Abraham's brother, Haran, is Lot's father. The post-flood ends with the death of Haran. Haran is, you know who his son was? Haran. He's a brother of Abraham. And he had a son. And that son went with Abraham to many, many, many places. You think, huh? Lot, thank you. That's right. Oh, man, I've got to quit here in a second. Let's see what else I need to mention. Terah is said to take a family in verses 30 to 32, including Abraham to Canaan. Maybe Abraham's father knew about God's call for him to leave Ur of Chaldees. I don't know. But he took his father with him, and he died in Canaan. He went to Canaan, either way, and he died in Haran. Abraham was 75 years old when he left Haran. So now I've got to quit because they're lined up at the door. Anything anybody wants to say before we... Yeah.
How did people get in America?
Yeah.
How did people get on all these islands?
Yeah.
When you think about this time, this is about the Tower of Babel and the languages that have been confused and scattered on. This, when it's talking about the continents divided up and
Yeah.
had different people on it.
Yeah. I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, it's just questions, so you go to Australia, there's all sorts of animals that nobody sees anywhere else.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
they want to make all sorts of theories of how people got to America, but then again,
When you have one big continent and it happened to be split apart, I mean, that's a possibility.
this part, and you've already got all that stuff
Yeah.
all over the world.
Yeah. Amazing.
Question, it's just thought.
Yeah. We'll be in Genesis chapter 12 next time. We're in Genesis chapter 10. Genesis chapter 10, you could call it the Table of Nations. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time with chapter 10 because it's so closely related to chapter 11. So there's a lot of names that I can't pronounce that I make an attempt to, so bear with me. If you know the actual pronunciation, then you straighten me out and we'll move right on. so we won't spend a lot of time in chapter 11. The point of the interest of these verses, it gives a division of the families of Noah. That's the main thing. It's interesting it doesn't begin with Shem and his descendants. It's through the line which Jesus is going to come. It begins with Japheth and Ham. Just like when you are looking at Cain and Abel's descendants, or Seth, it gives Cain's descendants first, and then and the same here. It begins with Japheth and Ham, and then it goes to Shem, and then there we go. We take off from there to show Jesus Christ coming into the world. This chapter covers the history of God's purpose to bring Jesus Christ into the world. Really, if you want to back up to chapter 8 and verse 20, that's really when chapter 9, chapter 10, chapter 11 is dedicated to. And in chapter 8 and verse 20, then Noah built an altar to the Lord and took every clean animal and every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And the Lord smelled the soothing aroma. And the Lord said to himself, I'll never again curse the ground on account of man, for the intent of man's heart is evil from his youth, and I will never again destroy every living thing as I have done. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. And it hasn't, has it? Always been the same. So we'll follow from this point, Noah's sacrifice. Also, God's divine promise that he'll never again flood the entire world. And then it also, we've already covered the two other events in Noah's life, and all of this still has worldwide importance, doesn't it? Everybody, and no matter where you go, I think Darwin told me there was a big high mountain in Arkansas right below his house or by his house. He went up on top of that mountain in Arkansas, and there's seashells everywhere. And that's just about anywhere you want to go in this world. So Noah's sacrifice brought the promises of God here. Never again would he flood the earth completely. He gave us a symbol. What was the symbol? The rainbow. And every time we look at that rainbow, every one of us remember, don't we? We remember. It's just amazing. God's word is. It's just absolutely amazing. Noah's prophecy later was a curse and a blessing on his sons, either whichever it was, curse or a blessing, and also the sons dividing up into different families. Chapter 10 gives that division of families. It's an inspired arrangement of the generations, and it begins in chapter 10 with Japheth arranging those families that broke off from Semitic, which includes the Hebrews and others. Records of the division of one race into many different languages and nations, and that's in chapter 11, and that's where I'm trying to get to quickly. Into the family of Abraham, it follows through where the Messiah is going to come. That was the purpose of God, is to send a Savior for us. And so in verse 1 through 5 of chapter 10, it says, these are the generations, the history of the generations that rejected God first, given those who remained faithful to God and continued into development will also be included here in a minute. The table of nations doesn't include all races, but only those of the Hebrew, Egyptian, Assyrian, all that sphere of influence where they first go to. The nations are mostly tribal. They're not individuals. They're arranged according to zones and areas and not by continents. Japheth belongs to 7 families. They were called the sons of Japheth in verse 2. In verse 3 and 4, there are 7 others that are called grandsons. Some of these nations later will oppose Israel. We see that in Exodus 38 in verses 2 through 6. Some migrated to different areas, what we now know, like Russia, and that's in Exodus or Ezekiel chapter 12. Now here we go on some names here, so bear with me. Ashkenaz was the grandson of Japheth. His name is given to the Mysians or the Phaeacians, which is now in Turkey. The nation of Javan is a Hebrew term for the Greeks, like the Iconians, the Isle of the Gentiles used by the Jews. Refers to Japheth on the colonies of the coast of the Mediterranean, Black Sea, Caspian Sea. Okay, the table of nations continues from verse 6 through 32. In verses 6 through 20, you have the generations of Ham. I don't know how you'd say Ham's generations. Hamitic generations are named. Hebrews are brought closer relationship with them. Either the families of Ham, sometimes were their friends and sometimes they were enemies. The races are mainly located in Africa, Arabia, east coast of the Mediterranean, Mesopotamia, where the three great empires were located. Cush, in verse 6, is the southern Arabia, also known as Cush. You see them in Genesis 2:13, Cush, Isaiah 11 and verse 11, Ezekiel 38 and verse 5. Moses' wife is a what? Cushite. She is from Cush. Numbers 12 and verse 1, you'll see that. Moses' wife was called a Cushite. Anybody remember her name? Moses' wife? Zipporah. You win. Zipporah. Zipporah was a Cushite. Numbers 12 and verse 1. Let's see. There's 7 branches named in verse 7 that are Havilah is possibly Arabia. Nimrod is in verse 8 is an Assyrian. He's the founder of the early kingdom of Babylon. The Canaanites in verse 18, they were ancient inhabitants. Palestine, Lower Syria, and the greatest period was the conquest by Joshua of the Canaanites. Ham's youngest son was Canaan, verse 15, has 6 sub-tribes of Joshua's time. And I'll call their names and you'll remember: the Hittites, the Jebusites, and Amorites, and Arvadites, and all of these are sub-tribes of that. And then verses 21 through 31 traces the development of the line of promise through the descendants of Shem. The reference is to the seed of the line of Christ. All this is written to show us that God's in control of man's history in order to bring His Son, Jesus Christ, into the world to save us from our sins. And also we're told that in Galatians 4 and verse 4 that He would come in the fullness of time. Shem is a race which will come Jesus. That's why they're listed last. We'll go right into chapter 11 here in a second. Because of the calling of Abraham. Abraham came out of Ur of Chaldees. Genesis 11 and 12 we'll see. Abraham's seed is Jesus Christ. Galatians 3 verse 29. Shem is called the father of Eber in verse 21. There's 2 sons, Peleg and Joktan. Boy, what a tough one. Joktan. Joktan, verse 25. Shem is the oldest son of Elam in Persia. And so you get all of these names and all of these nations and all of these divisions that are going to happen after that sacrifice that we read, and Noah built an altar to the Lord, and we're going to see all the people come together, one nation, one language, one everything, and so we're going to see what they're going to do in chapter 11. And so they split off, and this is showing us those splits that are going to happen. They hadn't happened yet. And then we read in verse 32 of chapter 10, verse 32, Moses' conclusion. These are the families of the sons of Noah, according to their genealogy, by their nations, and out of these the nations were separated on the earth after the flood. So There's Moses' conclusion right there. The genealogical record listing the nations that existed after the flood. So chapter 10 is a kind of, I call it a preparatory event to chapter 11, because chapter 11 we're going to see it start right there. So the chosen family of Abraham is about to be separated from its country. This will help us understand why so many nations knew God, because they all were together. And as Jesus puts it, even the hairs on our head are numbered. So God always had a plan. In order to save humanity, God needs to separate a people for his own possession, through which Jesus Christ comes into the world. I don't know what else to say. Later, God's going to separate Israel from all the nations as his children, to be separate from the world, just as Christians are to be today. Yes, sir. Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Basically, you see the whole thing here, that the Shemites always, in the Bible, always fighting the Hamites.
Yeah.
And that was Jephthah.
Yeah.
He's going up north somewhere, and they don't do much about him.
Yeah.
So the Greeks and all that. So
Yeah.
you read these names, you'll see these people have been fought for
The land.
yeah.
Yeah.
The Israelites run the Canaanites out
Yeah.
so they can live there.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, and all of those worshipped idols and whatever they worshiped, but they fought constantly. Thank you. Anybody else before we go to chapter 11? Chapter 11, verse 1 and 2. Now the whole earth used the same language and the same words. It came about as they journeyed east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. Now I'm going to stop there for a second. After the flood, Noah and his family migrated back to where they were from the beginning, in the Euphrates area. And all humans had the same what? Language. Had the same language. They used the same words. The land of Shinar, they settled, and the earliest Hebrew records gave that name Shinar. Early Hebrew records used the name Babylonia or Babel, or the land of Babel. So it was the name of the district where the other cities there were beginning. Also, you'll see Nimrod's kingdom. That's what he founded, the nation of. Country of Babylonia. So the ancient site of Shinar has not been found by archaeologists. They think they have. They think they found it, but they don't know for sure. The ancient language, nobody knows what that language was today. Nobody knows what it was. The original language that everybody used, but the ancient language of that area was thought to be Sumerian, which was a mix of Turkey and Chinese. But nobody knows that for sure. It's never been determined what the original language was spoken. Shinar seems to exist before the Tower of Babel was built. And so once they're there, they come up with their own plan. So verse 3 and 4. They said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they used brick for stone, and they used tar for mortar. They said, "Come, let us build for ourselves a city whose top will reach into heaven, and let us make for ourselves a name otherwise we'll be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth. I'm going to stop there and we'll get to 5 in a second. So it was at Shinar that people decided to build this tower, and the tower was to go where? To heaven, up into the heavens. It was composed of burned brick. It was not sun-dried brick. That's what the Egyptians always did, the sun-dried brick. But the reason I'm pointing this out, this burned brick, it became hard as stone. And they used tar for mortar. And the archaeologists, that's why they think they have found that place, because they found brick that was burned. They burned it and it became like stone. And so they think, this is different from everybody else. Everybody else uses sun-dried brick. And so they got to looking around, and there's also a location for tar pits. And tar is what they use for mortar. So they're pretty close, to what may have been the original location. It's always interesting to watch those videos that I watch sometime about where these archaeologists are doing all these things. So if you back up a second to chapter 10, verse 8 through 11, Cush, or the son of Ham, was the father of Nimrod. He lived between the flood and Abraham. He may have been one of the leaders of building the Tower of Babel. We don't know for sure, but verse 10 of chapter 10 says the beginning of his kingdom was Babel. So verse 11 in chapter 10 tells us that he also built Nineveh. What was important about Nineveh? It's a great city. Who was at Nineveh? And he converted the entire city, and he didn't even want to. Jonah. He tried to go the opposite direction from God. But you can't run from God. He was down the bottom of the ship going to Tarshish or wherever he was going to, the opposite direction where God was sending him to. And so he didn't want to go, but he was convinced. How was he convinced? In the belly of a great fish. He was convinced. He had seaweed all over him, and he prayed to God. When you get time, look at his prayer. It's amazing prayer. He prays to God and repents, and he said, I'm going to do what you want. And he'd been thrown up on the shore. But he still wasn't convinced. They were enemies of Israel, and he didn't want them to be converted. And he sat on the hillside. First of all, he walked through the city of Nineveh for 3 days. That's how big that city was. He preached God's word one day, then the next day, then the next day. It took him 3 days. And after 3 days, he went up on the hillside and sat down, didn't he, Darwin? He was hoping that God wasn't going to spare them. He wanted God to destroy them people. And so he disappointed at his results. It's amazing to me but that's what he did. And then he went through some more education that God had to give him about a plant and a shade. And he thought more of the plant than he did a whole city of 120,000 people. So there you see, anyway, the people's attitude, they thought no one can stop us. The tower was built in an effort to keep people together when God wanted them what? God wanted them scattered. Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. But these people, they were all together, same language, same everything, and they wanted to keep the people together. They didn't want to be scattered. They didn't want to subdue the earth and conquer the earth that God told them to. The people had an attitude that nobody could stop them, that they could accomplish anything, and mainly that they had the attitude, we don't need God. That's what the attitude was. So verses 5 and 6. The Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. And the Lord said, behold, they are one people, and they have the same language, and this is what they began to do. Now nothing which they purpose to do will be impossible for them. I'm going to stop there. We'll come back to 7 in a second, but the Tower of Babel, you know what I'd call the Tower of Babel? This is just me. I call it a tower of unbelief. They really got to thinking pretty much of themselves. It was a memorial to themselves. They're not interested in God. They're not even interested in consulting God. And they don't even seem to depend on Him. In contrast to Noah's obedient heart. And like today, people get caught up in self-purpose, don't they? What's good for me? Rather than, what does God want me to do? Instead of the will of God. Verse 6, behold, they're one language. They have the same language, one people. And God said, look at what they began to do. They have all these things, one tongue, one race, one purpose. There's nothing they plan to do or purpose to do that would be impossible for them. We're talking about earthly things. They would never be like God. They never would. But their focus and their purpose is not God. Everybody with me? Their focus and purpose is all about them. And so in verse 7 he says, come, let us go down there and confuse their language so that they will not understand one another's speech. This is amazing to me because God is going to settle the matter right here, isn't He? He's going to settle it. All the people's planning and all their building and all the plans they had, and they left out God, and now they're going to pay the price. And that happens the